Now, I urge you to go to the internet and look up a clean break. You can Google it, and you can see it's a policy paper. It was signed and published by an Israeli think tank and signed by Mr. Fife, Mr. Pearl, and 3 others, including David Wormser, who is now a chief aide to Dick Cheney, his Middle East specialist. When it comes to Iraq, George W. Bush made a fool of himself with his declaration of mission accomplished. And yet, that assertion has the ring of truth about it when it comes to the lobby's role in provoking the conflict. In unleashing the dogs of war in the Middle East, the lobby certainly has accomplished its mission of advancing its version of Israel's legitimate interests in the region. The only problem is that America's interests have been ill-served and perhaps irreparably damaged for many years to come. I have to point out that the views of the Israel lobby and those of most American Jews are poles apart. And this has been one of the big problems of the lobby, especially recently. Americans of a Jewish faith are sick and tired of having some war-crazed loon who believes that Israel must eternally confront its enemies militarily and without benefit of nuance or negotiation, represent the interests of Israel in America. The lobby's claim to speak for American Jews is a lie, and one that is fast coming unraveled, as more and more Americans, many of them true friends of Israel, are dissenting from the extremist views of her so-called leadership. The replication of the World War II scenario, an alleged Islamo-fascist danger, the demonization of war opponents as fifth columnists and probable anti-Semites, the attempt to scare the populace into going along with the most intrusive and authoritarian measures in the name of national security has been pretty successful. All the elements, as I have noted, are there. But there's just one problem. There's no Hitler. Oh yes, of course, we've heard for years how the latest targets of the US government, Manuel Noriega, Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and right now I guess it must be Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, I can't say his name, the president of Iran, is the modern equivalent of Hitlerian evil. Yet none of these rather louche characters quite measures up to the real thing. Hitler commanded the mightiest war machine of his time. His armies decimated Europe, thrust into Eurasia, and nearly took the British Isles. None of these other characters has even come close in terms of representing a credible military threat. At least back in the 1930s, the war party could make a credible case that the Axis powers posed a threat to the continental US and certainly to the other Western democracies. But does anyone seriously believe that Iran is about to invade France and occupy Paris? Or that Saddam Hussein was a threat to anyone outside of Iraq? This is really the Achilles heel of the war party. The alleged threat that is supposedly looming over our heads like a nuclear sword of Damocles is a fraud and has been exposed as such by the complete absence of those infamous weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The entire rationale for the invasion and occupation of a country that had never attacked us was centered around the existence of nascent Iraqi nukes, which the Iraqi dictator was supposedly planning to pass off to various terrorist groups who then hit the United States. This turned out to be pure malarkey. In lieu of any real evidence of a danger to the US, they simply made it all up. And people are mad about it, which is why the administration's efforts to paint a similar picture as far as Iran is concerned is meeting with some pretty stiff skepticism. These people are utterly discredited when it comes to making such allegations. The debunking process, in which I am proud to say antiwar.com played a major role, has been enough to hold them off, at least so far. These are the dog days of the war party. Their cadre are deserting them in droves, the public hates their guts, and members of their own party, I refer of course to the Republican Party, are rising in rebellion, if only out of fear of the public's wrath. The investigation into their shenanigans has hardly begun with the indictment and conviction of Scooter Libby, and the prospect of jail time for a few more of the war party's leading figures cannot fill them with anything other than trepidation. The American people are waking up, and their awakening has been rude in the extreme and bound to get ruder with each passing day, as the so-called surge yields a higher casualty rate and the Iraqi insurgency plays havoc with our pretensions to being the new Rome. Yet, the war party still has a few cards to play. The trump card is held by the President of the United States, who is sadly the commander-in-chief and has the power ceded to him by a complacent and complicit Congress to launch a war on his own authority. George W. Bush could, at any moment, launch an attack on Iran that would spark a regional war, the consequences of which would be unimaginably grave, not only for the peoples of the Middle East, but for Americans as well. Whether he is unbalanced enough to do it depends, one supposes, on many factors, one of which is the personality of a man who seems at times to be not quite in control of his own presidency. It also depends on the amount of pressure that the war party can exert. The future, as always, remains a dim shadow, and yet of one thing we can be fairly certain. The war party's tireless effort to recreate the conditions leading to World War II have been dealt a significant setback. 6 years ago, the day after 9/11, World War IV, as the neocons like to call it, seemed inevitable. Today, there are many factors militating against it, not the least of which is rising public opposition to our foreign policy of perpetual war. And for that, we must all be grateful. So, let us keep our fingers crossed and our polemics dry, and trust in the gods to guide us through this latest, darkest chapter in the struggle against war and for liberty. Thank you. Is there time for questions? Okay. Over there.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Ludlow from San Diego. Justin, I really want to thank you, by the way, for featuring the writings of Hakohen from Israel on your website, because it really helps keep us informed that the uniformity that's imposed here on these issues is not shared in Israel, and it's really, Rand Hakohen's pieces are wonderful to read. I have a question for you, though, because, and maybe you can give us a clue to this, but I recall that at the time of the 9/11 attack, there were two things that showed up and disappeared off the news, and both of these hit the major media. One was the dancing of the so-called art students or Mossad agents, whatever they were, in Jersey City, and that was covered in a major Jersey paper, the Newark Star-Ledger. I used to live there. It was like 2 million subscribers, and that made national news for like a second. And the other one that disappeared also was all that news about the short selling of stocks, if you recall, on United Airlines and American Airlines stocks, and that was, again, reported in the major media, and all of a sudden, it disappeared, and we never hear from this again. And I'm just wondering, how does this kind of stuff happen?
Right. Well, I mean, the short selling of stocks, I think that was debunked. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about it, and then there was some sort of explanation for it. I wouldn't put too much credence in that. The dancing Israeli thing is a far more serious thing. I wrote a book about that, well, a short booklet rather, and you can get it off the internet. It's called The Terror Enigma. And I mean, it seems to me clear that certain intelligence agencies knew that something was going to happen on 9/11, and that the Mossad was following the hijackers. That is their job, after all, to follow extremists, especially in America. And there was a 4-part series on Fox News about it that dropped down the memory hole.